To be prepared is everything in this life. Ever since her talk with Mr. Joseph Keeble in the High Street of Market Blandings that afternoon, Eve's mind had been flitting nimbly from one scheme to another, all designed to end in this very act of seizing the necklace in her hands, and each rendered impracticable by some annoying flaw. And now that fate, in its impulsive way, had achieved for her what she had begun to feel she could never accomplish for herself. She wasted no time in bewildered inaction. The miracle found her ready for it. For an instant, she debated with herself the chances of a dash through the darkened hall up the stairs to her room. But the lights might go on again, and she might meet someone. Memories of sensational novels read in the past told her that on occasions such as this, people were detained and searched. Suddenly, as she stood there, she found the way. Close beside her, lying on its side, was the flower pot which Psmith had overturned as he came to join her on the terrace wall. It might have defects as a cache, but at the moment she could perceive none. Most flower pots are alike, but this was a particularly easily remembered flower pot, for in its journeying from the potting shed to the terrace, it had acquired on its side a splash of white paint. She'd be able to distinguish it from its fellows when late that night she crept out to retrieve the spoil. And surely no one would ever think of suspecting. She plunged her fingers into the soft mould and straightened herself, breathing quickly. It was not an ideal piece of work, but it would serve. She rubbed her fingers on the turf, put the flower pot back in the row with the others, and then, like a flying white phantom, darted across the terrace and into the house, and so, with beating heart, groping her way to the bathroom to wash her hands. The 20,000-pound flower pot looked placidly up at the twinkling stars. It was perhaps 2 minutes later that Mr. Coutts, sprinting lustily, rounded the corner of the house and burst onto the terrace, late as usual. The efficient Baxter prowled feverishly up and down the yielding carpet of the big drawing-room. His eyes gleamed behind their spectacles. His dome-like brow was corrugated. Except for himself, the room was empty. As far as the scene of the disaster was concerned, the tumult and the shouting had died. It was going on vigorously in practically every other part in the house, but in the drawing-room there was stillness, if not peace. Baxter paused, came to a decision, went to the wall, and pressed the bell. "Thomas," he said, when that footman presented himself a few minutes later. "Sir?" "Send Susan to me." "Susan, sir?" "Yes, Susan," snapped the efficient one, who had always a short way with the domestic staff. "Susan, Susan, Susan, the new parlour-maid." "Oh, yes, sir, very good, sir." Thomas withdrew, outwardly all grave respectfulness, inwardly piqued, as was his wont, at the airy manner in which the secretary flung his orders about at the castle. The domestic staff at Blandings lived in a perpetual state of smouldering discontent under Baxter's rule. "Susan," said Thomas, when he arrived in the lower regions, "you ought to go up to the drawing-room. Nosy Parker wants you." The pleasant-faced young woman whom he addressed laid down her knitting. "Who?" she asked. "Mr. Blooming Baxter. When you've been here a little longer, you'll know he's the fellow that owns the place. How he got it, I don't know. Found it," said Thomas satirically. "In his Christmas stocking, I expect. Anyhow, you're to go up." Thomas's fellow footman, Stokes, a serious-looking man with a bald forehead, shook that forehead solemnly. "Something's the matter," he asserted. "You can't tell me that wasn't a scream we heard when them lights was out. Or," he added weightily, for he was a man who looked at every side of a question, "a shriek. It was a shriek or a scream. I said so at the time. There, I said. Listen, I said. That's somebody screaming. I said, or shrieking. Something's up. Well, Baxter hasn't been murdered, worse luck, said Thomas. He's up there screaming or shrieking for Susan. Send Susan to me, proceeded Thomas, giving an always popular imitation. Susan, Susan, Susan. So you'd best go, my girl, and see what he wants. Oh, very well. And Susan, said Thomas, a tender note creeping into his voice, for already brief has been her sojourn at Blandings. He had found the new parlour-maid making a deep impression on him. If it's a row of any kind, or description, interjected Stokes. Or description, continued Thomas, accepting the word. If he's harsh with you for some reason or other, you come right back to me and sob out your troubles on my chest, see? Lay your little head on my shoulder. Tell me all about it. The new parlour-maid, primly declining to reply to this alluring invitation, started on her journey upstairs. And Thomas, with a not unmanly sigh, resumed his interrupted game of halfpenny nap with colleague Stokes. The efficient Baxter had gone to the open window and was gazing out into the night when Susan entered the drawing-room. You wish to see me, Mr. Baxter? The secretary spun round. So softly had she opened the door, and so noiselessly had she moved when inside the room, that it was not until she spoke that he had become aware of her arrival. It was a characteristic of this girl Susan that she was always apt to be among those present some time before the latter became cognizant of the fact. Oh, good evening, Miss Simmons. You came in very quietly. Habit, said the parlour-maid. You gave me quite a start. I'm sorry, what was it? She asked, dismissing in a positively unfeeling manner the subject of her companion's jarred nerves. That you wished to see me about? Shut that door. I have. I always shut doors. Please sit down. No, thank you, Mr. Baxter. It might look odd if anyone should come in. Of course. You think of everything. I always do. Baxter stood for a moment frowning. Miss Simmons, he said, when I thought it expedient to install a private detective in this house, I insisted on Raggs sending you. We had worked together before. 16th of December 1918 to January 12, 1919, when you were secretary to Mr. Horace Jevons, the American millionaire, said Miss Simmons, as properly as if he had touched a spring. It was her hobby to remember dates with precision. Exactly. I insisted upon your being sent because I knew from experience that you were reliable. At that time I looked on your presence here merely as a precautionary measure. Now I am sorry to say... Did someone steal Lady Constance's necklace tonight? Yes. When the lights were out? Just now? Exactly. Well, why couldn't you say so at once? Good gracious, man, you don't have to break the thing gently to me. The efficient Baxter, though he strongly objected to being addressed as man, decided to overlook the solecism. The lights suddenly went out, he said. There was a certain amount of laughter and confusion, then a piercing shriek. I heard it. And immediately after Lady Constance's voice crying that her jewels had been snatched from her neck. Then what happened? Still greater confusion, which lasted until one of the maids arrived with a candle. Eventually the lights went on again, but of the necklace there was no sign whatever. Well, were you expecting the thief to wear it as a watch chain or hang it from his teeth? Baxter was finding his companion's manner more trying every minute, but he preserved his calm. Naturally the doors were barred and a complete search instituted, and extremely embarrassing it was, with the single exception of the scoundrel who had been palming himself off as McTodd. All those present were well-known members of society. Well-known members of society might not object to getting hold of a £20,000 necklace, but still, with the McTodd fellow there, you oughtn't to have had far to look. What had he to say about it? He was among the first to empty his pockets. Well then, he must have hidden the thing somewhere. Not in this room. I've searched assiduously. There was a silence. It is baffling, said Baxter. Baffling. It's nothing of the kind, replied Miss Simmons tartly. This wasn't a one-man job. How could it have been? I should be inclined to call it a three-man job. One to switch off the lights, one to snatch the necklace, and one to... Was that window open all the time? I thought so. And one to pick up the necklace when the second fellow threw it out onto the terrace. Terrace? The word shot from Baxter's lips with explosive force. Miss Simmons looked at him curiously. Thought of something? Miss Simmons, said the efficient one impressively, everybody was assembled in here waiting for the reading to begin, but the pseudo-McTodd was nowhere to be found. I discovered him eventually on the terrace in close talk with the Halliday girl. His partner, said Miss Simmons, nodding. We thought so all along. And let me add my little bit. There's a fellow down in the servants' hall that calls himself a valet, and I'll bet he didn't know what a valet was till he came here. I thought he was a crook the moment I set eyes on him. I can tell him in the dark. Now, do you know whose valet he is? This McTodd fellow's. Baxter bounded to and fro like a caged tiger. And with my own ears, he cried excitedly, I heard the Halliday girl refuse to come to the drawing-room to listen to the reading. She was out on the terrace throughout the whole affair. Miss Simmons, we must act. We must act. Yes, but not like idiots, replied the detective frostily. What do you mean? Well, you can't charge out as you looked as if you wanted to just then and denounce these crooks where they sit. We've got to go carefully. But meanwhile, they'll be smuggling the necklace away. They won't smuggle any necklace away, not while I'm around. Suspicion's no good. We've made out a nice little case against the three of them, but it's no use unless we catch them with the goods. The first thing we have to do is to find out where they've hidden the stuff, and that'll take patience. I'll start by searching that girl's room. Then I'll search the valet fellow's room, and if the stuff isn't there, it'll mean they've hidden it out in the open somewhere. But this McTodd fellow, the fellow who poses as McTodd, he may have had it all the while. No, I'll search his room too, but the stuff won't be there. He's the fellow who's going to get it in the end because he's got that place out in the woods to hide it in, and they wouldn't have had time to slip it to him yet. That necklace is somewhere right here. And if, said Miss Simmons with a grim facetiousness, they can't hide it from me, they may keep it as a birthday present. How wonderful, if we pause to examine it, is nature's inexorable law of compensation. Instead of wasting time in envy of our mental superiors, we would do well to reflect that these gifts of theirs, which excite our wistful jealousy, are ever attended by corresponding penalties. To take an example that lies to hand, it was the very fact that he possessed a brain like a buzzsaw that rendered the official Baxter a bad sleeper. Just as he would be dropping off, bing, would go that brain of his, melting the mists of sleep like snow in a furnace. This was so even when life was running calmly for him and without excitement. Tonight, his mind, bearing the load it did, firmly declined even to consider the question of slumber. The hour of 2, chiming from the clock over the stables, found him as wide awake as ever he was at high noon. Lying in bed in the darkness, he reviewed the situation as far as he had the data. Shortly before he retired, Miss Simmons had made her report about the bedrooms. Though subjected to the severest scrutiny, neither Smith's boudoir, nor Coutts's attic, nor Eve's little nook on the 3rd floor had yielded up treasure of any description. And this, Miss Simmons held, confirmed her original view that the necklace must be lying concealed in what might almost be called a public spot, on some window ledge maybe, or somewhere in the hall. Baxter lay considering this theory. It did appear to be the only tenable one, but it offended him by giving the search a frivolous suggestion of being some sort of round game like Hunt the Slipper or Find the Thimble. As a child, he'd held austerely aloof from these silly pastimes, and he resented being compelled to play them now. Still, he sat up thinking. He had heard a noise. The attitude of the majority of people towards noises in the night is one of cautious non-interference. But Rupert Baxter was made of sterner stuff. The sound had seemed to come from downstairs somewhere, perhaps from that very hall where, according to Miss Simmons, the stolen necklace might even now be lying hid. Whatever it was, it must certainly not be ignored. He reached for the spectacles that lay ever ready to his hand on the table beside him, then climbed out of bed, and having put on a pair of slippers and opened the door, crept forth into the darkness. As far as he could ascertain by holding his breath and straining his ears, all was still from cellar to roof. But nevertheless, he was not satisfied. He continued to listen. His room was on the second floor, one of a series that ran along a balcony overlooking the hall, and he stood leaning over the balcony rail, a silent statue of vigilance. The noise which had acted so electrically upon the efficient Baxter had been a particularly noisy noise, and only the intervening distance and the fact that his door was closed had prevented it sounding to him like an explosion. It had been caused by the crashing downfall of a small table containing a vase, a jar of potpourri, an Indian sandalwood box of curious workmanship, and a cabinet-sized photograph of the Earl of Emsworth's eldest son, Lord Bosham. And the table had fallen because Eve, en route across the hall in quest of her precious flower-pot, had collided with it while making for the front door. Of all indoor sports, and Eve, as she stood pallidly among the ruins, would have been the first to endorse this dictum, the one which offers the minimum of pleasure to the participant is that of roaming in pitch darkness through the hall of a country house. Easily navigable in the daytime, these places at night become mere traps for the unwary. Eve paused breathlessly. So terrific had the noise sounded to her guilty ears that every moment she was expecting doors to open all over the castle, belching forth shouting men with pistols. But as nothing happened, courage returned to her, and she resumed her journey. She found the great door, ran her fingers along its surface, and drew the chain. The shooting back of the bolts occupied but another instant, and then she was out on the terrace, running her hardest towards the row of flower-pots. Up on his balcony, meanwhile, the efficient Baxter was stopping, looking, and listening. The looking brought no results, for all below was black as pitch, but the listening proved fruitful. Faintly, from down in the well of the hall, there floated up to him a peculiar sound, like something rustling in the darkness. Had he reached the balcony a moment earlier, he would have heard the rattle of the chain and the click of the bolts, but these noises had occurred just before he came out of his room. Now all that was audible was this rustling. He couldn't analyse the sound, but the fact that there was any sound at all in such a place at such an hour increased his suspicions that dark doings were toward which would pay for investigation. With stealthy steps, he crept to the head of the stairs and descended. One uses the verb descend advisedly, for what is required is some word suggesting instantaneous activity. About Baxter's progress from the second floor to the first, there was nothing halting or hesitating. He, so to speak, did it now, planting his foot firmly on a golf ball, which the Freddie Threepwood, who had been practising putting in the corridor before retiring to bed, had left in his casual fashion just where the steps began. He took the entire staircase in one majestic volplaning sweep. There were 11 stairs in all, separating his landing from the landing below, and the only ones he hit were the 3rd and the 10th. He came to rest with a squattering thud on the lower landing, and for a moment or two the fever of the chase left him. The fact that many writers in their time have commented at some length on the mysterious manner in which fate is apt to perform its work must not deter us now from a brief survey of this latest manifestation of its ingenious methods. Had not his interview with Eve that afternoon so stimulated the Honourable Freddie as to revive in him a faint yet definite desire to putt, there would have been no golf ball waiting for Baxter on the stairs. And had he been permitted to negotiate the stairs in a less impetuous manner, Baxter would not at this juncture have switched on the light. It had not been his original intention to illuminate the theatre of action. But after that Lucifer-like descent from the 2nd floor to the 1st, he was taking no more chances. Safety first was Baxter's slogan. As soon, therefore, as he had shaken off a dazed sensation of mental and moral collapse, akin to that which comes to the man who steps on the teeth of a rake and is smitten on the forehead by the handle, he rose with infinite caution to his feet, and feeling his way down by the banisters, groped for the switch and pressed it. And so it came about that Eve, heading for home with her precious flower pot in her arms, was stopped when at the very door by a sudden warning flood of light. Another instant, and she would have been across the threshold of disaster. For a moment, paralysis gripped her. The light had affected her like someone shouting loudly and unexpectedly in her ear. Her heart gave one convulsive bound, and she stood frozen. Then, filled with a blind desire for flight, she dashed, like a hunted rabbit, into the friendly shelter of a clump of bushes. Baxter stood blinking. Gradually his eyes adjusted themselves to the light, and immediately they had done so he was seized by a fresh frenzy of zeal. Now that all things were made visible to him, he could see that the faint rustling sound had been caused by a curtain flapping in the breeze, and that the breeze which made the curtain flap was coming in through the open front door. Baxter wasted no time in abstract thought. He acted swiftly and with decision. Straightening his spectacles on his nose, he girded up his pyjamas and galloped out into the night. The smooth terrace slept under the stars. To a more poetic man than Baxter, it would have seemed to wear that faintly reproachful air which a garden always assumes when invaded at unseemly hours by people who ought to be in bed. Baxter, never fanciful, was blind to this. He was thinking. That shaking up on the stairs had churned into activity the very depths of his brain, and he was at the fever point of his reasoning powers. A thought had come like a full-blown rose flushing his brow. Miss Simmons, arguing plausibly, had suggested that the stolen necklace might be concealed in the hall. Baxter, inspired, fancied not. Whoever it was that had been at work in the hall just now had been making for the garden. It was not the desire to escape which had led him, or her, to open the front door, for the opening had been done before he, Baxter, had come out onto the balcony. Otherwise, he must have heard the shooting of the bolts. No, the enemy's objective had been in the garden. In other words, the terrace. And why? Because somewhere on the terrace was the stolen necklace. Standing there in the starlight, the efficient Baxter endeavoured to reconstruct the scene, and did so with remarkable accuracy. He saw the jewels flashing down, he saw them picked up, but there he stopped. Try as he might, he could not see them hidden. And yet that they had been hidden, and that within a few feet of where he was now standing, he felt convinced. He moved from his position near the door and began to roam restlessly. His slippered feet padded over the soft turf. Eve peered out from her clump of bushes. It was not easy to see any great distance, but fate, her friend, was still with her. There had been a moment that night when Baxter, disrobing for bed, had wavered absently between his brown and his lemon-coloured pyjamas. Still recking of what hung up the choice, fate had directed his hand to the lemon-coloured, and he had put them on, with the result that he shone now in the dim light like the white plume of Navarre. Eve could follow his movements perfectly, and when he was far enough away from his base to make the enterprise prudent, she slipped out and raced for home and safety. Baxter, at the moment, was leaning on the terrace wall, thinking. It was possibly the cool air playing about his bare ankles that at last chilled the secretary's dashing mood and brought the disquieting thought that he was doing something distinctly dangerous in remaining out here in the open like this. A gang of thieves are ugly customers, likely to stick at little when a valuable necklace is at stake, and it came to the efficient Baxter that in his light pyjamas he must be offering a tempting mark for any marauder lurking, say, in those bushes. And at the thought the summer night, though pleasantly mild, grew suddenly chilly. With an almost convulsive rapidity, he turned to re-enter the house. Zeal was well enough, but it was silly to be rash. He covered the last few yards of his journey at a rare burst of speed. It was at this point that he discovered that the lights in the hall had been switched off, and that the front door was closed and bolted.